We have talked about Russia in the past. It may be, I wasn't a member, but way back when it started in 1980, I'm sure they talked about the Cold War and the Soviet Union. And Russia has continued to be in our thoughts. There has been a number of meetings. One that I recall personally was beginning of March 2022, when we stood to the national anthem of Ukraine, some solemnness, and many of you will have been here for that when Bill Emmett talked about the implications. And we have had, in various ways, Russia has been discussed directly or indirectly over time. But there is so much that we still want to understand, and so we're very lucky that tonight we have with us Sir Roderic Lyne. I won't go through his personal biography. You've seen it for 6 months on our website. You've seen it on the screen behind me. But as you will see, he has got many and varied contacts within Russia that will give him a wide sense of that country, well beyond the particular subject of the person who leads it. And many of us will regard as personally responsible for the mayhem there. But I don't want to prejudge anything that Sir Roderic has to say. And you've seen what the title is, What Future for Russia? Over to Sir Roderic Lyne.
Well, good evening. Thank you very much for asking me to this remarkable, unique, and to have used the English language, iconic association. It's a great pleasure to be here. In Soviet times, there used to be a saying which has now come back into fashion since Vladimir Putin started rewriting history books, which ran as follows: the future is certain. It's the past which is impossible to predict. Well, I'm supposed to be talking about the future, so I will start with the impossible past. On the last weekend of May 2003, Vladimir Putin held a huge birthday party to celebrate the 300th anniversary of his home city in St. Petersburg. And in a cable to the Foreign Office about this event, I described it as Sergeant Major Putin's Lonely Hearts Club Band. We hope you enjoy the show. He invited over 40 world leaders, the President of the United States, all the leaders of the G7, the European Union. They all made time to travel to this purely ceremonial, completely content-free, utterly pointless event, just to gratify their new friend Putin. And it wasn't even the real anniversary of St. Petersburg either. In the following week, the G7, the world's top table, meeting in France, formally invited Putin and Russia to join the group as a full member. And then 3 weeks after that, still in June of 2003, Putin became the first Russian president since 1874 to pay a full-dress state visit to Britain. We forget now that 21 years ago, the sun was shining on Putin and on Russia. Putin had been 39 when the Soviet Union dissolved. He didn't regret the end of communism. Like most of his generation, he'd ceased to believe in it. He didn't regret the end of the command economy. He knew it didn't work. He'd been in Dresden. He'd seen how far ahead the West was. But he was deeply humiliated by the loss of status and the loss of power of the KGB, by seeing the KGB reviled and mocked, by seeing Felix Dzerzhinsky's statue pulled down from in front of the Lubyanka. And like most of his generation, especially military veterans and officers in the armed forces and the security organs, Putin bitterly regretted the end of the Soviet Union and of superpower status. He and his peers simply could not conceive of Ukraine and Belarus in particular as genuinely independent nation-states. These were two Slavic regions forming a large part of the Russian motherland, intertwined and often intermarried with Russia and without clear natural boundaries. Indeed, just over, 2.5 years ago, on the eve of the invasion of Ukraine, he called Ukraine an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. That's what is firmly in his mind. Now, if we go back to this period of 2003, Putin started off in his first 3 years by trying to strengthen the state, which needed doing, develop the economy, which desperately needed doing, and also, rather more controversially, to integrate Russia much more closely with Western and Central Europe. So he put his government in the hands of a number of highly intelligent reformists. The rule of law improved. The gangsterism of the 1990s became a fading memory. Inflation came down towards single digits. By 2003, GDP had more than doubled in 4 years, and Russia was beginning to attract significant foreign direct investment from things like the oil majors, the mining companies, the brewers, the car manufacturers, and so on. And Moscow was on its way to becoming, and some of you I'm sure will have been there in recent years, I hope you have, come its way to becoming a very fine, rich city on a par with Western European capitals. In his foreign policy, Putin, straight away on becoming acting president of Russia, ended the argument that had grown up with NATO in the previous year after the bombing of Belgrade. A couple of years later, he was perfectly content to acquiesce in NATO's second enlargement, which brought the Baltic states into NATO. The relationship between Russia and NATO was upgraded. The Russia-NATO Council was put into existence. There was a big NATO-Russia summit in Italy in 2002. And Putin made friends with all the big leaders of the West, with Tony Blair, who he met 9 times in his very first year in office, with Gerhard Schröder, who he basically put in his back pocket. Schröder would do exactly what Putin wanted, and Schröder disgracefully went on to Putin's payroll when he ceased to be the German Chancellor. And particularly, and importantly, with George W. Bush. Bush, you will remember, was bedazzled by Putin. When he first met Putin in 2001 in Ljubljana, he famously, notoriously said, "I looked the man in the eye. I was able to get a sense of his soul." That's a remark that Bush will go to his grave regretting. But at that time, Putin was being extremely helpful to Bush. He was the first foreign leader to ring Bush after 9/11. He helped the Americans get into Afghanistan in their hunt for bin Laden. And he and Bush, over the course of Bush's 2 terms in office, had no fewer than 28 meetings. Then there was the EU. Russia was building a strategic partnership with the EU. Russia was on its way to joining the World Trade Organization. And on the ground in Russia at that time, we, the British, other Western countries, had ranges of cooperation that had never, ever been seen before in the whole of our history. And I could spend the next half hour talking about them, but simply say we were helping to cut up Russian nuclear submarines. We were helping to destroy Russian chemical weapons. We, the British, under a program paid for by the British Ministry of Defence, retrained over 20,000 Russian officers for civilian life. The British Council was spreading its wings right across Russia, advising on education reform. We were trying to deal with tuberculosis in prisons. We were trying to stop the rise of HIV/AIDS, and on and on and on. So we were in this extraordinary honeymoon with Russia. Looking at Russia's neighbors, we had also in that time a pretty harmonious situation. The Russians were getting on perfectly well with their ex-Soviet neighbors, and particularly with Ukraine. They actually ran a lot of the Ukrainian economy. And very few Ukrainians back in that period were even beginning to dream of joining NATO. There was a poll in 2006 in Ukraine which showed that only 12% of the Ukrainians polled favored joining NATO. 5 times as many were against. So that was then. Where are we now in 2024? Well, we've now found that 1991 was not the end of the Soviet Union. It was merely the beginning of the end. What we thought was a peaceful collapse and ever closer collaboration between us and them has turned now into monstrous bloodshed, while the last heirs of the Soviet dictatorship, led and personified by Putin, are making what is a desperate last stand, above all to retain Ukraine, and were Belarus to try to leave, they would do the same in Belarus. So why did this honeymoon turn into this pile of corpses that we now see with such horror? Well, one reason for this was the price of oil. Hydrocarbons are the lifeblood of the Russian economy. 60% of Russia's export revenues have come from hydrocarbons. They used to provide 40% of the Russian state budget. And the average annual oil price tripled between 1998 and 2004, and then it was going to go on to a peak in 2008 that was 8 times the price, 9 times the bottom price of 1998. So Russia went in very short order from being poor to being rich. And I was there at the time, and you could feel the oxygen coursing through the veins of the Russian economy and of the Russian body politic. After years of anguish and barely suppressed rage at Russia's weakness and loss of power and status, suddenly there was this mood of arrogance. They were saying, "We are back." They were effectively making Russia great again in their own image. And that led to a very sharp change of direction within the country. Putin pushed out the reformist ministers. He and his cronies started seizing complete control over wealth and power, in fact, now to the point where they control 4/5 of the Russian economy, either state-owned or owned by people who are umbilically connected to the Kremlin. It was a time when opportunism and greed triumphed over the long-term modernization of Russia and Russia's closer integration into the world. And they were saying, we do not any longer need to listen to these outsiders, whether it was the IMF, the Americans, the British, the European Union, you name it. Since then, we've seen the progressive, incremental stifling of freedom of expression in Russia, freedom of expression that Gorbachev gave to them from 1987 onwards for the first time in their history, and especially seen this repressive behavior following the demonstrations that happened in 2011, 2012, when Putin was rigging yet another parliamentary and presidential election. Russia's external policy also swung at that time through 180 degrees. And there was another reason for this. From 1991, despite all of this cooperation, all of this friendship, genuine friendship, this partnership that I've talked about, the Western Russia had taken diametrically opposed views of the sovereignty of the former Soviet states. There was a deep-rooted belief of the Russian elite and of people of Putin's generation that the former Soviet states, what they called the near abroad, were inherited parts of Russia's historic zone of influence. Now, Boris Yeltsin thought that he had agreed a format for a sort of Soviet Union light. It was his intention that the Soviet Union should be transposed into the Commonwealth of Independent States, a voluntary union, but a union run from Moscow with a common currency, a common economy, no internal boundaries, and critically, with its defense and security run by Russian generals out of Moscow. And Russia, in this concept, would have effectively had a strategic veto over major decision-making in these supposedly independent countries. Now, Yeltsin discovered too late that the other states, the Balts had effectively already gone, but really we're talking about the 12 non-Baltic states of the Soviet Union. But the other states actually rather liked being independent, and the Ukrainians in particular. I remember going to Ukraine a lot in the early 90s because I was responsible for opening our relations with them, and they were euphoric about independence. In fact, they were too euphoric about independence because they were saying, we are now going to be one of the 4 great powers of Europe. The 4 great powers of Europe will be Britain, France, Germany, and Ukraine. And you'd say, well, that's great. It's a lovely aspiration, but you've got a lot of work to do. Oh, no, no, no. We're going to be one of the 4 great powers of Europe because we're independent. And I think that Moscow had totally underestimated that, as indeed Putin clearly has underestimated the will of the Ukrainians to resist his military. Now, while that was the view of, as I say, a very large number of people of Putin's generation in Russia, we in the West, of course, looked at these states as genuinely independent sovereign states, full members of the United Nations, countries that had a right to decide on their own relationships. Now, for many years, this irreconcilable difference of view was a sort of hidden fault line under the surface of our relationship, under the surface of an amicable relationship. And Putin, I think, calculated that as he built up closer relations with the West, which he did so assiduously in this first 3 or 4 years of his time as president, that he could get us, at least tacitly, to recognize Russia's zone of influence. It was absolutely an article of faith for Putin that these neighboring countries should not join what he and his friends tend to call a Western camp. We cease to think of the world as being divided into camps, but I don't think that Putin and his friends are capable of doing that. He also believed that as Russia was a great sovereign independent power, not quite a superpower but pretty near, that the West had no right to tell him how to run his own country, how to deal with Chechnya, or how to hold elections. So we had this underlying source of friction, this fault line, and the earthquake broke through the surface at the end of 2004 with the Orange Revolution in the place that mattered most of all to Putin, that is to say, Ukraine. And the Orange Revolution, where, of course, we were lining up very sympathetic to the Orange side, which was the more democratic party, and Putin was trying to insert into power his puppet Viktor Yanukovych in a rigged election that the Ukrainian people then overturned. That was the moment when Putin realized that building relations with the West was not going to bring him a second Yalta agreement. It did not mean that the West was going to accept Russia's right to control its neighbors in an acknowledged zone of influence. And ever since then, ever since that moment of the Orange Revolution, when Putin was furious, he was humiliated, he was so angry that people in the Kremlin told me that when he came into the office in the morning, they'd all hide under the desks. He was so angry that for some weeks he refused to take telephone calls from any Western leaders, even his pal Gerhard Schroeder. And he was so shaky that people in Moscow were saying in the early part of 2005, is there going to be a Maidan here? Is Putin even going to last to the next presidential election in 2008? This was his worst ever, most humiliating defeat. And ever since that moment, we have seen the relationship between the West and Russia spiraling downwards via the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, up to the second crisis in Ukraine in 2014, where once again, by this time, Viktor Yanukovych had become president, but he was refusing to sign an association agreement with the European Union. The Ukrainian parliament, the Ukrainian people wanted him to sign that, and effectively that led to a second revolt against Yanukovych, a second ouster, to which Putin retaliated by seizing Crimea and starting this war in Ukraine. This war has been going on since March of 2014, although, of course, it took on a new dimension in February of 2022. So let me turn now, but fairly briefly, to the Ukraine war, because again, we could spend all evening talking about this, and I'll be happy to talk about it more if you want to ask questions about it. In a recent article in The Spectator, Mark Galeotti, who I think you've had as one of your speakers in the past and is one of the best commentators on Ukraine, very neatly said, describing the current situation, Russia is losing, and then he went on to say, Ukraine is losing faster than Russia. And I think that's accurate. We're in a situation now where both sides, after nearly 3 years of war, are severely depleted in troops, in equipment. I mean, the Russians are running out of tanks quite fast and running out of barrels for their guns, and in finance. Neither side can sustain the war at this level indefinitely, but possibly the Russians can sustain it a little bit longer than the Ukrainians. Both sides at this moment, as we've seen over the last few weeks, are raising the ante. All this talk of escalation, these new threats from Putin, these new forms of rocket attack. They're doing so against the presumption that Donald Trump will come into office to push for a negotiated peace. So they are trying to raise the stakes ahead of what they expect to be some form of negotiation. But of course nobody, and possibly not Donald Trump, has got a clear idea of Trump's plans. I've read about 5 different versions already of people who claim to know, and nobody knows. We simply do not know what Trump is going to do. But we need to remember an old Russian proverb. If you invite a bear to dance, it's not you who decides when the dance is over. It's the bear. Well, in this case, Putin is the bear. Putin has shown no sign up to now of any willingness to compromise, of any genuine interest in negotiating an end to the war. Putin is doing the opposite. He is trying to crush the Ukrainians. He is trying to force the Ukrainians to capitulate. He wants to subjugate Ukraine to Russia's will. And he thinks that time is on his side, despite the fact that Russia is under considerable stress. So let me just try to list 5 possible scenarios, none of them, I'm afraid, very cheerful. The worst one, I think, from our point of view, would be that Ukraine could collapse. If US aid is cut off, if the German election goes the wrong way, and the Germans, who have been the largest supporters of Russia in Europe, they've given about $20 billion worth of aid to Ukraine, if they reduce or cut off their aid, if Russia succeeds in demoralizing the Ukrainians by completely destroying their power supplies, as it's trying to do, if it makes a breakthrough on the front, as it is also trying to do, expending massive numbers of troops in casualties, then you could have a situation where Ukraine sues for peace on Putin's terms. I think that's possible, but I don't think it's at all probable. I don't think it's probable because I think the Ukrainians are determined to resist until such time as they have secured their freedom, if they can. So my second scenario would be that this attritional war simply continues, ghastly though that is, on its present lines without a ceasefire. That Ukraine continues a defensive strategy that it's now following of trading space for Russian losses. And we read in our papers the Russians have just taken another 97 square miles last week. They took 297 square miles in 1 month about a month ago. You have to remember that just to control Donetsk and Luhansk, which is their minimum near-term target, they need actually to control another 4,000 square miles. So getting 97 square miles in a week is not that big a deal in terms of territory. Obviously, if they broke through the lines, we'd be in a different situation, and that is the fear. But the Ukrainians are, at the moment, holding them back, albeit with great difficulty. Under this continuing scenario, you would still have significant European and possibly American, we don't know what Trump's going to do, support for Ukraine, and the intensity of the war, for the reasons I've given, would certainly diminish by late 2025 with both sides depleted. I think that's quite a likely scenario, and it's a very gloomy one. Third scenario would be a ceasefire negotiated under American pressure that preserved the existing lines of contact and effectively froze the conflict. That has got a number of problems. First problem is that Putin would make demands of a very high caliber. He would demand Ukrainian neutrality, he would demand that Ukraine's forces were not reinforced, and he would almost certainly demand that sanctions were lifted as his price for agreeing to a ceasefire. And then on the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainians, I do not think, will agree to a ceasefire unless they have got some assurances of stronger Western support to protect them from further Russian attack. And I think that would probably mean Western troops on the ground in Ukraine some form of security, because I don't think it's likely to mean immediate membership of NATO. Now, there's maybe a 50% chance of a deal on those lines, but I think it will only happen if the Americans can find some real leverage over Russia, which might mean they have to get tougher with Russia before actually trying to talk to Russia. And I think the Americans will find that they have a pretty tough negotiation on their hands with the Ukrainians. They cannot simply, I read sometimes in the papers about Trump will impose a settlement. He can't impose a settlement on the Ukrainians. He will have to get their agreement, and that will not be so easy. Fourth scenario, the most optimistic one, if you like, is that there will be a definitive, genuine peace settlement. Now, we sometimes read that all wars end in negotiation. That, of course, is rubbish. Between 1946 and 2005, only 16% of interstate wars ended in a peace agreement. Another 30% ended in a ceasefire, and about 21% ended in victory, and the rest just didn't end. So all wars do not end in negotiation. A definitive peace settlement is even more remote a possibility, or a much more remote possibility in the near term, it may come eventually, than a ceasefire, because Ukraine would require two things as its fundamental demands: irrevocable Russian recognition of their sovereignty, and physical, on-the-ground Western guarantees of security, not just bits of paper. They have asked for NATO membership, but I think right now that's not actually going to happen. And Zelensky, in his 5-point plan, effectively referred to this. He said his third point in his 5-point plan for what he called victory was that Ukraine should have comprehensive non-nuclear strategic deterrence package on its territory, sufficient to protect the country from any military threat posed by Russia. Well, you have to ask, would Putin accept that as on his side of the table? And the answer is, I cannot see him doing so, which means that a lasting peace, I fear, is going to have to wait until either Putin is under much greater pressure because of the war, or he leaves the stage. Final grim scenario, again, we read in our papers about this sometimes, is that this could become a wider war. People like to write articles about the beginning of a Third World War, which this is not at this point, and I think the Americans, and for that matter, the Chinese, are very determined it should not become. There's speculation that Russia might go on to attack Poland or the Baltic states, NATO member states. Well, I think Russia will continue to do what it's already doing, which is disrupting and subverting NATO member states, cyber attacks, arsons, all sorts of things being done. It will try to test NATO's resolve, but I believe that Russian generals are absolutely in no doubt of the grave consequences were they to make a frontal attack on a NATO country. And I also believe that the Russian military, after this war, are not going to be in any shape to fight another war anytime soon. Enough on the Ukraine war. Let me now turn to the next bit of the future. When Putin goes. I mean, Putin's 72. He's a young man by my standards. But he's not immortal. The last years of Putin, I think, are going to be brutal, and they're going to be dangerous. He's lost a lot of support in his own country. He's made a huge mistake over this war. He's having now to use massive repression to hold power, and I think he and his associates will use as much force as is necessary to cling on to power. But at some point, as I say, he will go. And there's a lot of uncertainty about what happens next. There are some people who've written about the possible disintegration of Russia. I don't believe that. If you want to know why, I will tell you more later. But there is a genuine fear that you will move into an unstable situation. The security organs in Russia will play probably the most important part in the transfer of power. The next leader is going to have to be able to command the loyalty of these huge, multifarious organs of security in Russia. It's not just the FSB and the GRU, there's the FRO, the Rosgvardia, and so on and so forth. Probably after some kind of behind-the-scenes struggle between rival clans within this world. I think it's quite possible that in the first instance power would pass from Putin if he died or was incapacitated or was proving so hopeless that somebody could persuade him to leave, just to one of his closest associates. But they're all pretty old, like Putin. But then I think the most likely eventuality is it'll move on to a mini-Putin. One of those who are now in their 40s and 50s, who have risen under Putin, are now in sort of second-tier positions, have essentially been groomed by him. Could be another secret policeman, or it could be a technocrat, but a technocrat backed by the organs of security. But the important point is, this will be, at last, the beginning of a generational change. A change to Russia's first post-Soviet leadership. People who were not brought up and worked in the Soviet Union in the way that Putin and his friends did. And these will be people with a different mindset. They'll be more widely traveled, they'll have a much better understanding of the world, and I think they may be a lot more pragmatic than Putin. So let's just look at this generation. Imagine that you are maybe 5 years, maybe 10 if we're pessimistic, but somewhere between 5 and 10 would be my likely frame. The next generation leader of Russia. What's the legacy that you're going to inherit from Putin? It is dire. Firstly, you've got the consequences of the war with Ukraine. Russia has already lost something like 200,000 troops killed, another 400,000 severely injured, and this is going up all the time. 40% of the Russian budget is being spent on defense. Society has been remilitarized. Kids are being trained in patriotic military themes, going to military camps, joining young cadet forces. They will inherit this huge breach with the West, probably still with sanctions, and they will inherit a Russia that Putin has put in hoc to China. I mean, China has been a free rider in this confrontation between Russia and the West. And they will indeed inherit a situation where Putin has got Russia to such a low point that he had to go on bended knee to kowtow to Kim Jong-un in Korea to say, please can I have 3 million artillery shells, and now can you send 12,000 troops because I'm running out of troops. And that, to any Russian, is indeed a pretty bad situation to be in. Then the next generation leader is going to inherit a failing economy, an economy distorted by corruption. GDP in Russia is now below the level that it was at 11 years ago. They've lost the European gas market, 85% of it. In fact, Gazprom, the largest company in Russia that used to provide of its own 10% of the Russian budget, is bust. It lost $6 billion last year. It lost $5.5 billion in the first half of this year because they made all their money selling gas to Europe. They sell at a loss in Russia. Oil revenues are falling. And as you look ahead down the road, hydrocarbon revenues, whether you're Russia or Saudi Arabia, are set to fall very steeply, certainly from 2030 onwards, as the world moves more and more into renewables. Then inflation is rising. The base rate of the Russian central bank is now 21%. That is killing businesses. One of Putin's closest associates, Sergei Chemizov, who runs a big arms company, said the other day, if we continue to work like this, then most of our enterprises will go bust. That's the route that they're on. And they're suffering from the most acute labor shortages. It's estimated that by 2030, and this comes from a Russian deputy prime minister, there will be a shortfall of 2.4 million Russians in the labor force. It's been made worse by the losses in the war. It's been made worse by the number of people sucked into the defense industry. And of course, it's made worse by Russia having an extremely low birth rate. And last year was the lowest point since 1999. Then they will inherit a country that is technologically backward, a country with low productivity, a country that lost about 2 million of its most skilled professionals who, over the last 20 years, have decided that they'd rather live outside Russia because they don't like Mr. Putin. About 1 million of them have left since the invasion of Ukraine, a country that has notably low investment in research and development, less than 1% of GDP. We invest about 2.5%, the Koreans about 3.5%. Soviet science used to be one of the strong points of the Soviet Union. Russian R&D is way, way behind. There is minimal robotization in Russian industry, and they're now cut off from Western suppliers and sophisticated Western equipment, so they're very short of things like advanced chips. And if you haven't got advanced chips from NVIDIA and people, then you are going to fall further and further behind as the artificial intelligence revolution lifts the more advanced economies upwards. And then you've got the infrastructure right across Russia is in a desperately poor state because of a lack of investment. So who wants an economy like that? I'd rather be Rachel Reeves. And then we look at Russian society, their social problems. Well, if you spend 40% of your budget on defense, what on earth are you doing to health, education, welfare? You are squeezing them, you are starving them. So there was a 23% cut the year before last in the money spent just alone on medical services. And these were all in a bad condition before this war started. They're all now on a downward trajectory, and they affect ordinary people, millions of people right across the country. Criminality has gone sharply up since the start of the war, some of it because veterans returning from the war, including some of the 60,000 Russians who were let out of prison to go and fight, those who haven't died in the meat grinder, are coming back and committing violent acts back within Russia. Alcoholism is going right up again, having dropped for many years. And then the security. And the poor next Russian leader is still going to have to cope with some serious risks coming from Islamist extremism. We all saw this horrific attack on the Crocus City concert hall in March of this year, which killed and injured hundreds of people. That was an attack by Islamic State terrorists from Tajikistan. The North Caucasus is not under secure control. Chechnya and Dagestan, the two biggest parts of the North Caucasus, are almost ungoverned spaces as far as Moscow is concerned. They're under local warlords, and they're now in a big argument with each other. And I indeed would forecast that within 30 to 40 years, Russia will have made a complete exit from the North Caucasus, but I won't be here to see it. They've never actually managed to control that area from the time that in the 19th century they started to take it over. So, you are the successor generation in Russia, the next leadership, maybe the next leadership but one. What are your options? What sort of a Russia are we going to see at that period? I think there are sort of two poles, and probably the answer will be somewhere between the two, but if I just take the two poles, my first pole would be what I call Putin plus. And I'd like to quote what one of Putin's more liberal former advisors said, actually just before the Ukraine war, about the future of Russia. He said that they had reached the conclusion of Russia's epic journey towards the West, the ending of numerous fruitless attempts to become part of Western civilization, the precursor to 100 years of geopolitical solitude. Well, that was Vladislav Surkov, who in our book would not be rated as a raging liberal. That's his very pessimistic view of Russia. Certainly in the short term, it's not an impossible one. They are already in near geopolitical solitude. The country is militarized. It could remain militarized. They could continue the rigid indoctrination of the young in a very conservative, nationalistic ideology, continue to constrain freedom of expression, continue a state-run economy based on natural resources, but at the cost of ever-declining living standards. They could continue to be hostile and disruptive towards the West, and indeed potentially dangerous, as they are, but constrained also by their own relative weakness. They could refuse to concede sovereignty to Ukraine and continue to try to dominate all of their neighbors by force, subversion, and threats, all the things that Putin has been doing. And they would become ever more beholden to China as the junior partner. And I think there is the big catch in this, because I do not think that proud Russians wish to be beholden to China. Right now, you cannot breathe a word of criticism of China in Moscow. I think that scenario, if you like, of a Putin plus is possible for the immediate successor, maybe the immediate 2 or 3 successors, but I don't think it is sustainable over time, because I think that there are forces in Russia that will almost require Russian leaders to change in the future. And so let me move to the modernizing scenario. Putin's view of Ukraine was, as I've said, widely shared by his age group, and certainly by the Orthodox Church, which has backed this war very strongly, not like churches do in other countries, and indeed has promised that troops who die in battle are guaranteed eternal salvation, which must be very comforting for them as they're fed into the meat grinder. That view will change. The younger generation in Russia had no problem accepting that Ukraine, because they've grown up with it, is an independent state. And I spent a lot of time when I was living there talking to students, and they had pretty similar attitudes to their counterparts in this country. They are very different from the old Soviet generation, even though now, of course, efforts are being made to indoctrinate them. I don't think those efforts are going to be wholly successful. Of course, no Russian wants their side to lose this war, even if you don't agree with the war, as many of us didn't agree with the Iraq war. You do not want your own boys to be killed and humiliated. You do not want your country to lose. But I'm pretty convinced that the large majority of Russians right now just want this war to stop so they can get on with their lives. But they feel that they are powerless to do anything about it, or even saying anything about it can lead them into prison. You probably read the other day that a 65-year-old female pediatrician was locked up for 5.5 years because in a consultation with a 7-year-old child, she had asked the mother where the father was told the father had died in Ukraine, and she'd made some sympathetic remark that appeared to be critical about the war. So the mother denounced her, and this lady, at the age of 65, doing a valuable job as a pediatrician, is now to serve 5.5 years in the Gulag. That's the sort of problem that you have in Russia at the moment if you oppose the war. Putin, of course, is never going to accept Ukrainian independence, but a future leader, any future Russian leader, even a Putinist Russian leader, is going to have to do the math. They're going to have to say, this is costing us. It's costing us in lives and money and material, and where are the benefits? And there are effectively no benefits. I mean, the only benefit to Russia from this is keeping Ukraine weak. And that's it. It's what I call the neighbor's cow, and I'll explain that later if you want. Now, Russian society is socially conservative. It's passively obedient, it's strongly nationalistic, and since the 1990s, it's become distinctly materialistic. So the standard of living matters, despite, if you like, the conservatism and the nationalism. Russians are proud. They don't want to live in a country which is falling behind. They don't want, as I say, declining living standards. They don't want a country which is not respected in the world, and nor do they like corruption. And any survey of Russian opinion over the past 20 years has shown that corruption is top of the list of things that people really object to, because it has reached such extreme levels, even though it's always been part of their system. They want to have a better rule of law. They'd like to get back the freedom of expression that they used to have. So I think that the leader of the next generation is going to be under huge pressure, particularly the economic pressure, to reverse the Putinist stagnation, to tackle these economic and social problems, and therefore to make another attempt to modernize Russia, to take it away from being a corrupt producer of raw materials and a bit of metal, which is roughly what it is right now. Oh, and defense equipment. But then what to do about China? There is this historical animosity between the Russians and the Chinese. The Russians, every Russian I ever knew was afraid of the Chinese. And they know, they don't talk about it, that the Chinese feel that in 1860 the Russians stole no less than 1.5 million square kilometers of Chinese territory by the Ussuri and Amur rivers in the far east of Russia, including what is now the big city of Vladivostok from China. This to the Chinese is still an unreturned territory Obviously, Taiwan is next on the list, but after that, well. And the Russians know that. They also know that China is not an ally in this war. China has declared itself as a partner. China still recognizes Ukraine. It still pays obeisance to the UN Charter. President Xi the other day was rather critical of the idea of expanding this war in public remarks he made in Russia at Kazan. And there are clear limits to this partnership. But what the Chinese are doing is they are exploiting Russia, and the Russians know this. They're driving very hard bargains. 40% of Russia's imports now come from China, and they're not very good stuff. But the Chinese have got them over a barrel. And so one of the big questions for a future Russian leader is whether he or she, but it won't be she, this is a very male-dominated society, can somehow wriggle out of the octopus grasp of Beijing. And in order to do that, you would certainly have to resume proper relations with the West, with Western and Central Europe, and therefore an end to the confrontation over Ukraine. Resuming relations with the West is going to be a very, very slow process. There's huge bitterness now built up on both sides. There's an anti-Western mood in Russia that will take time to dissipate. But I think the Europeans would be ready to play, and particularly I think the European countries nearest to Russia. Will there be democratization under this next generation leadership? Not anytime soon, I would say, because the sinews of power in Russia are the security organs and the bureaucracy. It used to be the Communist Party, that no longer, it does exist, but it is no longer in power. And it's really not easy to change that and to impose will over them. But what I do think will happen, because I think it will be popular and probably be quite effective, is a gradual devolution of power and a gradual widening of at least local or regional democracy, but probably not what we would regard as democracy at the center. And now to conclude, some of you may have read John Julius Norwich's wonderful short history of Sicily, which I read earlier this year. And there's a point there where he describes how the Huns swept across Europe in the 5th century. The Huns were savages, an undisciplined heathen horde, Mongolian in origin, which had swept down from the Central Asian steppe, laying waste everything in its path. Well, Russia is a complex country currently ruled by a ruthless psychopath, and some of the Russian forces in Ukraine have certainly behaved like Huns. But Russia is also a country where there are many decent and civilized people, people who want to live in a decent and civilized way, and who do not want to be ruled by Huns, thugs, and thieves. I think that they take a pretty pessimistic view of life. They keep their expectations very low. I think that's helped them to survive a very tough history. Well, we saw the pendulum swing in a civilizing direction in the period up to 2004. I don't utterly despair, indeed I do not at all despair, that at some point, possibly after I've been gathered by the Grim Reaper, it will swing that way again under a future Russian generation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for all your questions, and we'll try to do justice to them in the period ahead. And Rod, I'm going to start off with a little bit on the historical themes that you raised. And there's a general one expressed by two people, Ian Watson. Could the West have done anything differently to preserve good relations with Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union? And Joe puts Joe's section another way. Was the West's big mistake its failure to welcome Russia after the demise of the Soviet Union? Would you like to sort of reflect on that briefly?
Yes. If I take the second one first, we did everything we could to welcome Russia after the demise of the Soviet Union. Firstly, we worked very hard with Gorbachev on his reforms. Secondly, when the coup d'etat happened in Moscow in August of 1991, the very first person to ring up Yeltsin and support him as he stood on the tanks opposing the coup was one British Prime Minister, John Major. We gave enormous amounts of economic help to Russia. We founded something called the Know-How Fund. We did a massive amount. Did we get everything right? No, of course not. The problem with helping people is if they're proud people from a superpower that's just been humiliated, they find it slightly embarrassing. So getting aid of this kind, you really had to be very diplomatic in the way you did it. Mistakes? Well, George Herbert W. Bush, the elder, basically, I think, handled the situation pretty well, pretty sensitively, until he gave his last State of the Union address when he was running for re-election as president, when he came out in order to, as it were, try to get votes, and he said, "We won the Cold War." And he said it very loudly. And actually, America didn't win the Cold War. The Soviet Union did not collapse from America. It collapsed from within. And people in Russia thought, actually, we're the people who brought down communism, not you. So, first question. Second question, could we have done something different to prevent this happening? Well, yes. We could have said to Mr. Putin, yeah, you can have your zone of influence, no problem. You do what you like in Ukraine. And we could have sat back and let him do it without a full-scale invasion, and not supported the Ukrainians, and not helped to train their military. And it would have made it much easier for him. And fewer people would be dead now. So that would have been the net result of that. There are those who argue that NATO enlargement was the cause of this war. That is complete and utter rubbish. I believe this war would have happened if NATO had dissolved in 1991. There's a professor in America called John Mearsheimer, a professor of international relations, who maintains that the war is entirely the fault of the West. This is complete and utter nonsense. NATO was very careful about enlargement. It made sure that the first enlargement didn't happen for 7 years, till 1999, until NATO had built a relationship with Russia strong enough to bear the weight of enlargement. And Yeltsin acquiesced in this. It wasn't very popular, but he said, it's okay. Second time round, as I mentioned, 2002, 9 more countries, I think it was, or 7 more countries joined NATO. Again, NATO was building a very strong relationship with Russia, and Putin said, he went to a press conference in Brussels after meeting George Robertson, who he got on very well with, NATO Secretary General. And he went to this press conference and he said, well, what do you think about the Baltic states joining NATO? And Putin said, it's okay by me, so long as our cooperation with NATO continues on its current path. Indeed, nothing is excluded in the future, which was taken as a big hint that he might even join NATO. So I don't believe it was NATO, and I'm afraid it was unstoppable unless we were prepared just to give the shop away.
Here's a question which I'm sure you've fielded many times before, and for Andrew Hornsby. As Russia itself is such a big country, why do they want to have even more hard-to-control territory?
That's an extremely good question, because they are struggling to populate the east of Russia. In fact, if you go from the Urals to the Pacific coast of Russia, which is an area bigger than Canada or China, the world's second biggest countries, you will find now only about 25 million people, and the population is going down all the time. They can't persuade people to live there. Ukraine is attractive because it lies between Russia and Europe. From a security point of view, they've always seen it as a bit of a buffer. That's part of it. But above all, it's not so much about territory. There are some resources that they fancy in Ukraine, but they've got plenty of resources of their own. It is really back to this belief that the Ukrainians are theirs, that this is one people. They don't have a right to be separate. So it's not really, I think, just about the number of square miles they get. It's much more about the concept that the outer borders of Russia should include Ukraine and Belarus. And these are part of the elements that make Russia a great country. And they are obsessed with this idea of greatness. In fact, I once asked one of the brightest new IT industrialists in Russia, who was a very liberal-thinking, modern-thinking man, I said, what is actually needed really to modernize Russia? And he said, to get rid of this idea of velicie, greatness. But greatness is absolutely implanted in the soul, and having Ukraine is part of that.
Pauline Medovnikov is one of our members here. She says, I was working in the British Council in St. Petersburg in 2007-8, when it was forcibly closed down by the Russians and declared illegal. In hindsight, do you think we were fooled by the Golden Age?
What we were trying to do in the Golden Age, and again, that's a very good question, and I bitterly remember what happened to the British Council, is we knew that there was a risk that the window that was open would close. We were determined to take maximum advantage of it while we could. We knew the KGB was still there. We knew they were rebuilding their forces. We knew that there were some people, particularly in sections of Russia, particularly in the security organs, who disliked intensely Putin's policy of building relations with the West and were waiting for a chance to push him the other way, which the Orange Revolution gave him. What we hoped we were doing was carrying these processes far enough that we had implanted, if you like, seeds all the way across Russia in different fields. And the work that the British Council did across Russia was absolutely fantastic. Opening these resource centers. There were areas of Russia, you have an oblast of 4 million people with the British Council resource centre somewhere in the middle of it, where every single English teacher for these 4 million people would be signed up as a member of the British Council Centre and using materials from it. Russians getting scholarships over here. I talked about the officers we were retraining. Now, these were guys in middle life, and I'd go to these ceremonies, there'd be about this number of people in the room, all in uniform with medals, and they'd come up and they'd get a British diploma and a Russian diploma, and I'd hand over the British diploma, and they would look at me, and I'd say, where do you get those medals? And they'd say, fighting you guys in different places. And then they'd say, I've got one question for you. Why are you doing this? And I would say, it's not charity. We're doing this because you going into civilian life actually makes Russia a better place. It will help develop the Russian economy. We have an interest in that. It also means that we need fewer soldiers in our army. And when I come back to the British Council, the problem that arose with the British Council was a very specific one. In 2003, end of 2003, Putin wanted a Chechen political representative called Ahmed Zakayev to be sent back in chains from this country to Russia. And we said, we have rule of law here. So they mounted an extradition case. They lost. They lost fair and square. They couldn't accept that, and they kept saying to me, this is a political decision. Tony Blair, why has he done this? And the head of the KGB, FSB, actually said to me, he said, I want Zakayev and Berezovsky, for that matter, back here. I'm not interested in your rule of law. You send them back. Inachi budut ответные меры, which will be understandable to people who worked in the British Council in St. Petersburg. It means, or else there will be reciprocal measures, i.e. retaliation. And the retaliation took the form of these KGB types raiding the British Council, which weren't diplomatic premises, interrogating the staff, taking the computers, and progressively causing them to leave Russia. KGB always hated the British Council. Why? Because it was implanting liberal ideas, access to Western knowledge, access to education across Russia. It was subverting their concept of Russia. Also, they couldn't quite believe that we won't use it for spying purposes, though they couldn't work that one out because these offices were almost entirely staffed by Russians, except in St. Petersburg and Moscow. They're quite difficult to spy out of.
Still on with the sort of the history, the background that you gave us. Peter Bloodwood was asking if you could just elaborate a little on the Orange Revolution and its consequences. Just could you remind us?
Well, I mean, I think the key point is that it was the moment when Putin's friends in the KGB came along to him and said, look, mate, you've invested in these friendships. People like the Americans, there's Hillary Clinton very actively supporting the Orange side. And they claimed that the Maidan, the revolt in the middle of Kiev, was something organized by the CIA and no doubt the British Special Services and the Poles and people like that. It wasn't a genuine expression of will. And Putin had very, very personally put himself on the line to get Yanukovych elected. Putin sent a lot of his own political team to Kiev to work on Yanukovych's campaign. A bit like the Labour Party sending people to work with Kamala Harris. Putin actually went to Kiev about 3 days before the polling day for a so-called commemoration of some past event. Actually, again, it wasn't on the right date. That was so that he could appear on a platform with candidate Yanukovych and give him his very public blessing. So when Yanukovych was thrown out, that was a really bad moment for Mr. Putin. And as I say, it left him pretty shaky, and his grip on power weakened for quite a while.
Cooperation. Now, here's a question from Tony MacDonald too. So we have the sense that everything's frozen, there's no cooperation between the West and Putin. But he says there still seems to be a high level of cooperation between Russia and the USA in the maintenance of the space station, for instance. In fact, Russia's almost completely reliant on the US in delivering and returning its astronauts. So he wonders what Putin thinks about that. But you might also want to comment, is there, do we have to cut everything off, or can certain things be sustained despite the overriding desire to stop Putin winning this war?
Not everything is cut off, and certainly the space station, some of you will have read the Booker Prize-winning novel, still continues, though it is far from certain that that form of cooperation will continue, but it suits both sides to leave that outside the argument for the moment. There are still channels of communication, and it's quite important that there are, in that the heads of the British and American forces are still, I believe, from time to time ringing out the General Gerasimov and other members of the General Staff in Moscow. It's quite important. They should be able to talk to each other, particularly when nuclear threats are flying around. There are still a substantial number of Western and even British businesses that have not yet left Russia. It's partly because selling their businesses was made quite difficult by Russia, so there's still some direct trade going on. There's very little cooperation now, I think, in the scientific and cultural areas, which in a way is a shame because you're reaching into areas of Russia where people are not necessarily great fans of Mr. Putin. There are still Russians, I'm told by my colleagues who are still serving there, who will come into the British embassy and have lunch with the British ambassador or drink his champagne and actually have a friendly conversation, despite the fact that they are being monitored by the KGB, but they then cover their backsides as they drive away. They go out on Twitter and they say, I've just seen the British ambassador and I kicked him all over the room and told him it was appalling that the British were allowing the Ukrainians to fire rockets against us. But there are still people who stay in touch. It's not completely shut down. It didn't shut down, of course, in the middle of the Cold War. And it's quite important that we don't shut everything down. We need to shut down the things that actually hurt, or directly or indirectly, Putin. It's very difficult to do that without actually hurting ordinary Russians.
And what about trade, physical trade? Is that
Well, trade has gone down and down and down, but it's not zero. I mean, the Russians are still selling some gas into Western Europe. The Austrians and the Hungarians, of course, and the Italians are buying a bit of Russian gas. It's only 15% of what they sold before. Their overall gas exports have plummeted to half of what they were pre-war to the whole world, and most of it's now going to China, but they can't send too much to China because they haven't got the pipeline capacity to do it. There are more things that we could do by way of sanctions, and these are being looked at in London and Brussels and Washington. There is more pressure that could be brought on manufacturing companies in Europe in particular that suddenly find they're selling a lot of widgets to Tajikistan or Kazakhstan or Armenia or Turkey. Trade in widgets gone up 3 times to there, but the Turks aren't using 3 times as many widgets because those widgets are then being sent on to Russia. We could tighten up on that through secondary sanctions. We could indeed use stricter measures to reduce the Russian sale of oil. There is nervousness among Western leaders doing that because it could cause a spike in the price of oil and make them unpopular at home because you will all be paying more at the petrol pumps, and then you'll be shaking your fist at Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer for allowing that to happen. So that is slightly inhibited.
Can we just turn briefly to what the Russian people might be thinking? So Rose Wheat wonders how much access the average Russian has to Western news or information, stuff on the internet, and so on. John Lee wonders whether the Russian people believe or did believe that Nazis were actually taking over in Ukraine and justifying the invasion. Did anyone ever believe that? And when you explore that, you're talking about the Russian people as a whole. Marie Potter wonders, is there a big difference in opinion concerning Putin between the educated city population and those people who are living out in the sticks in remote country areas? So I wonder if you could explore those aspects.
Answer to the last question, yes, there is a big difference. Putin is pretty unpopular in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Indeed, Navalny ran in a Moscow election a few years ago and got rather a high vote. And the sophisticated elite in Moscow, particularly the academics, the intellectuals, quite a lot of the scientists, are not big admirers of Mr. Putin, and his war isn't very popular in St. Petersburg. In St. Petersburg, you see very few of the so-called hero posters advertising the war. Obviously, as you get out into the regions, it varies enormously. I mean, this is a big country. You have to segment Russian opinion between levels of education, where people live, indeed, to some extent, their ethnic backgrounds. So it is a variable. How much access does the average Russian have at this moment to news from the outside world? Well, for the average Russian, very little, because a lot of the news channels have been cut off by the Kremlin, and most of what the average Russian gets is therefore through media that are effectively controlled by the Kremlin. Again, people in sophisticated parts of the elite have found ways round some of the barriers through VPNs, for those of you who are experts on computers, unlike me, that you can actually get around the barriers. So, it is a variable. Russian friends of mine living here tell me that they don't really discuss the war on the telephone with friends in Russia. If they do, they get into some kind of an argument, or they could be getting the friends into trouble. So I think there is an inclination to believe that somehow or another the West is being very beastly to Russia right now. I think there's puzzlement as to why they are fighting the Ukrainians, and therefore this has to be explained by the Kremlin as it's a proxy war. The Kremlin is in effect contradicting itself, because it started off by saying these are awful Nazis. That didn't really work as a line of propaganda, not least when the president of Ukraine is well known to be A, from a Russian-speaking area and a Russian-speaking family, and B, Jewish. So he's quite unlikely to be a Nazi. But they've changed the line now, and the line now is that Ukrainians are simply puppets, they're NATO proxies, and we're really fighting NATO attacking Russia.
We're going to take a microphone question. Front row, just in front of us.
Thank you for your talk. Going back to Ukraine, staying with Ukraine, what will the relationship, if any, between Putin and Trump mean for the Ukrainians?
I think this is a big unknown. I mean, Trump had a meeting with Zelensky when Zelensky was recently in America, and Trump said quite nice things about Zelensky after that meeting. I don't think Trump wants to be seen as Putin's patsy. I don't think he thinks it will play well for him if he gave too much away. If Trump can do a deal, this needs to be a triumph for Trump, not a triumph for Putin. And while there are people in Trump's entourage, even people he's appointed to senior positions in, like the Director of National Intelligence, who are staggeringly, not only soft in Russia, but really pro-Putin, the generality of Americans, I do not think, are huge admirers of Putin. You've got some people in the MAGA movement who are, because he's strong, he's conservative, and he's anti-LGBT. So you get support like that in certain quarters. But overall, my gut feeling is that Trump needs to prove that he's got something out of it for Ukraine, and that it's not just because he and Putin hugged each other and used to talk on the telephone and give it all away. And if he did try to give it all away, I mean, not only would the Ukrainians not play ball, they would continue to resist to the limits of their powers, even if it went down to guerrilla movements and partisans fighting in the woods, as they did after the Second World War. But also the Europeans would resist. Not all of them, but some of them would, including, I hope, us.
Since we're on Trump, John Kelly wonders whether Trump's actions might be more likely to drive China more towards supporting Russia. Have you any thoughts on that?
No, I think the Chinese are being very canny. They are supporting Russia to the extent that it suits them. I don't actually think that President Xi wants to get into a major conflict with America. A lot of people in America at the moment are talking about, the possibility of war with China, which is absolutely barking crazy, but there are people in Washington who, are forecasting this. And I think they've got it wrong. I don't think the Chinese are seeking war, and I think the Chinese will give ground. But it is terribly important for the Chinese to remain on terms with the Americans. Not least because the Chinese own a very large chunk of America's debt. They are the biggest holders of treasury bills. They also, obviously, intensely feel very threatened by Trump's possibility that he'd put 60% tariffs on China. We'll see. There'll be a negotiation about that, I think. I think that's probably an opening bid. I hope it is, because it's a fairly crazy proposal. But, I mean, China needs markets, and the Chinese economy is struggling at the moment. Their growth rates now is below 5%. They used to grow at 10%. They've got a lot of internal problems. They've got firms going bust. They've got empty building sites. And, China's not going well. So I don't think that China wants to get sucked into this war. I think it's kept its distance from it. It's very significant the Chinese have not provided weapons to the Russians, and they're certainly not providing troops to the Russians. They don't want Russia to lose, but I don't think that they want to get sucked in either.
On the historical narrative that we were pursuing, Roger Palmer's sort of wondering about Crimea and whether we should have been more rigorous in opposing what he describes as the seizure of Crimea. I don't know what language you'd like to use, but quick word on that.
Well, with hindsight, we did impose sanctions after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, but we probably should have been tougher then. But then that's applying hindsight to the question. But it was, quite a significant breach, and it wasn't just words. Sanctions were actually imposed after that. The truth is, I think the Ukrainians know that they're not going to get Crimea back. I wouldn't want to, if I was a Ukrainian, I would never say that. They know perfectly well it wasn't historically Ukrainian. I mean, historically it wasn't Russian either. It should belong to the Crimean Tatars. When they had Crimea, they didn't run it very well. They didn't make much money out of it. They didn't look after the Crimeans very well. The Crimeans did vote to be part of Ukraine rather than Moscow in the referendum, a free referendum on the 1st of December 1991, but only by about 52-48. It's worth remembering that Donetsk and Luhansk, supposedly Russian-speaking territories, voted by majorities of over 60% to be in Ukraine, not in Russia, in a free referendum. But Crimea was very marginal. But Crimea is not integral to Ukraine, and the Ukrainians know it, and I think the best that they might hope for is that if they had a settlement, that they wouldn't have to officially recognize Russia's occupation of Ukraine. You would have to say, well, the status of Crimea will be determined 30 years hence by a referendum, some sort of fudge over Crimea. But I would be astonished if under any circumstance Crimea went back to the Ukrainians, and I don't think that I think most Ukrainians accept that in their hearts, but they should not be saying that in public, not before a negotiation.
Switching to the here and now, Terry O'Neill is asserting that the gas transit agreements from Russia via Ukraine will terminate next month, and he wonders what might be the consequences. Are you up to the date on that?
Not really. I mean, the astonishing thing is that Russian gas is still transiting Ukraine after nearly 3 years of war, and it has not suited either side to cut it off, and the reason for that is basically money. They're both making money out of it. But in a sense, it's completely logical to cut it off. What the consequences will be, I don't know. I hope in a way that they bring the Hungarians to their senses, but we'll see.
Fine. I'd like to ask you about sanctions. Simon Greenhalgh would like to know how effective you think they've been.
I think they have been effective. I think if you thought the sanctions were going to stop the war, you're in cloud cuckoo land. Sanctions, I can only think of one case where sanctions have had an immediate effect, and that was in 1956, during the Suez Crisis, when the Americans told us that if we didn't reverse our policy and pull out, that they were going to cause sterling, still at the time a reserve currency, to crash. And we caved. All other sanctions that I can think of, on Iran, on Rhodesia, on South Africa, you name it, have been slow acting, but they hurt. Putin wants sanctions off. There's a Swedish economist who specializes in Russia called Anders Arsland, who calculates, I don't know if he's right or wrong, that sanctions have cost Russia about 2 to 3% of GDP over the period they've been applied. They're not stopping people going out to dinner in Moscow and eating well and the rest of it, but they are hurting in a whole lot of different ways. The most important sanctions obviously are the ones applying to hydrocarbon exports, but also to prevent the Russians having access to Western technology. And during the Cold War, that was a very effective sanction too. We had something called the COCOM Committee, which limited the supply of advanced technology to the Soviet Union. And if, for example, you run a Russian gas pipeline, when your turbines break down, you haven't got the replacement engines for it because they were bought from the West. They don't all break down at once, but over time they do. So I think sanctions are effective, but they're not a showstopper.
We've got lots of questions on the table. We've also got a microphone question on my right.
You've mentioned how the Russians see Ukraine as part of Russia, a common people. And you've also mentioned how the Chinese are trying to not become directly involved in the war. And you've also mentioned how the Americans are a little bit on edge with the Chinese. Where does Taiwan fit into this? Because the Chinese are treating Taiwan as part of China.
Well, we recognize Taiwan as part of China. The United States recognizes Taiwan as part of China. That's why you don't have a Taiwanese ambassador in London. We maintain trade offices with Taiwan. But we do actually recognize an outer boundary of China that includes Taiwan. So it is a very different situation. And how that will play out in the future, I don't know. Instinctively, I feel that the Chinese will play it long, therefore won't risk a frontal attack on Taiwan. They are trying to calculate all the time to what extent the Americans would come in on Taiwan's side. And it would be sensible of the Americans to keep them in a great deal of doubt on that. I think the Chinese reckon that given enough time, there will be a situation where they are strong enough, Taiwan is vulnerable enough that they can pressure Taiwan into effectively being reincorporated in China. And the Chinese might be prepared to wait quite a while for that rather than risk a conflict. But I'm no China expert, that's the feeling in my gut.
I'm going to tour around some of the countries around Russia with questions here. So Nick Sharman wonders whether Putin will use his statelets, as he puts it, in Moldova and Georgia to claim sovereignty and start wars in that direction, or would he choose Kaliningrad to start a war with the Baltic states? Where do you think they are on the Richter scale of risk?
I don't think Putin has ambitions to annex Georgia or Moldova. Actually, I don't think he wants to annex Ukraine per se. He simply wants to control Ukraine. I think his optimum solution for Ukraine, as for Georgia, as for Moldova, would be that these were notionally autonomous states, that they ran themselves internally, but under orders from Moscow and within limits set by Moscow, which was a bit like the situation we had in the Soviet Union when Ukraine and Belarus had separate seats at the United Nations, but they didn't fool anybody. But there are limits to the Russian capacity to run other countries, and actually running Georgia, although they occupy parts of Georgia at the moment, is quite hard work because the Georgians are pretty feisty people. So I think that's what they're seeking to do. That comes back to what I was saying about the zone of influence. As for Kaliningrad, well, if the Russians wanted to start a war with one of the Baltic states, they can provide a number of different excuses, of which Kaliningrad is one, but not the only one, to do it and claim a provocation. It's easy to mount a provocation in Estonia because in the eastern part of Estonia you have a large Russian population concentrated around Narva, and you could claim that their rights were being infringed and you're going in to protect them. That would be the line of argument that they would use in Estonia. But their basic problem in actually starting a war in the Baltic states, I mean, they are attacking the Baltic states at the moment in different ways. They were the earliest victims of cyber attacks. There's a lot of subversion going on around there. But the fundamental problem in a military attack is that there are NATO forces, tripwire forces, in the Baltic states. They're not strong enough to oppose a major Russian assault. There are British troops, of course, among them. But it would oblige the Russians to fire upon NATO troops. And in the minds of the Russian General Staff, that is a very, very dangerous thing to do. It's never been done, and it's the first step on an escalatory ladder that could lead you ultimately to Armageddon, which they're not terribly keen on any more than we are.
Poland. Bob Winter, Linda Sherwood asking slightly different questions about the future or the vulnerability of Poland as this war progresses. Do you have any thoughts about its strengths and weaknesses?
Well, if I was a Pole, or indeed if I was a Balt, I would of course feel very nervous because you're very close to Russia. And indeed, that's true in Finland and Sweden, where they're making much more active preparations to defend themselves. They've joined NATO. They're actually telling the population to, just be prepared in different ways. And so it's completely understandable, this nervousness. But from a Russian perspective, Poland now has, I think it's the largest army in European NATO. It's certainly a very, very substantial army. And Poland is a NATO member state. So same as with the Baltic states, the moment you attack a NATO member state, you are crossing the reddest of red lines. We hear a lot about red lines. This is a very big red line. So I don't think the Russians, who are already pretty depleted by this war, are in a condition, absent NATO, to go to war with a large Polish army, because it's a much stronger army than the Ukrainians had to start with. And I certainly don't think that at the moment they are mad enough to start a war with NATO. I mean, I hope to God I'm right. But I think you've got enough sane people, and I don't think Putin's insane. I do think he's a psychopath, as I said, but that's different. I think you've got enough sane people at the top of the military apex in Russia who are not going to do that.
Can I just take two questions that seem to be in opposition to each other? I mean, Hugh Gledhill wonders whether India and China are not embarrassed by implicitly supporting Putin's war, where they see that he's attacking a neighbour and slaughtering its population. That's on the one hand. But on the other hand, we've got an interesting point here from Chris Nibbs He says, I watched the civilian aircraft movements into Russia. Obviously, he's got good computer power. Nothing has changed since sanctions, he says. Russia still has many friends and traders, especially in the global south. So how do we Brits get a proper sense of how all these other countries are viewing what's going on with Putin and Russia?
Well, Putin held this jamboree in Kazan recently, the so-called BRICS summit, and tried to make it appear that he had this large group of major countries from the global south supporting him. But of course, it wasn't actually true. They didn't support Russia's proposals for de-dollarization, which was the big Russian initiative at the summit. They have substantially different positions on a whole range of issues, and almost none of those countries had voted in support of Russia when the United Nations condemned the invasion of Ukraine. India is not supporting this war, but India is enjoying, rather like China, certain benefits from it. In particular, the Indians are now buying vast amounts of oil, very cheap, from Russia, because 78% of Russia's oil exports now go to China and India. They always used to send a certain amount to China, very little to India, and they're buying this at a $20 discount. But India in recent years has got much closer to America. It used to have very scratchy relations with America. And indeed, it's got, very big interests in Europe. So India is not siding with Russia. And when you put India and China together in the same group, India and China fight each other from time to time up on the glaciers. And they are rivals to be major Asian powers. And India is quite nervous of China's attempts to expand its power in China. And then you look at some of the other countries who are allegedly in this group, like Brazil or South Africa or whatever. Their support is heavily qualified. These are not countries that are sending weapons to Russia. They are not countries that are voting in favor of the war. Most of them, like China, have diplomatic relations with Ukraine. They recognize Ukraine's existence. So I think the smoke and mirrors. I mean, Russia has bought the support of North Korea. Well, that's not a great ally to have politically, but it's quite useful militarily. It has got drones from Iran and sent some kit the other way. Iran's in a pretty turbulent condition with a failing economy, and it's got this limited partnership with China. And these are countries that are sometimes described as an axis. They're not an axis. They are not collaborating closely with each other. These are four bilateral relationships going outward. And they're four countries with totally different systems, from Stalinism in Korea to a communist-run capitalist China to a far right-wing dictatorship in Russia and to a theocracy in Iran. These are not really bedfellows.
I'm going to finish in two areas. I'm awfully sorry that we've got lots of questions. You've been so stimulated tonight. But let's start off with one question, which is about nuclear. So Steve is wondering more generally, what about nuclear? Julian Barry puts it in a more concrete way. Given that Putin, and I think these are your words, is a ruthless psychopath, as he becomes increasingly desperate, Julian wonders whether there are sufficient sane individuals to prevent a nuclear holocaust being triggered by Putin.
Bob Woodward came out with a book recently on the Biden administration in which he claimed that in late 2022, the Biden administration had thought there was a 50% chance that the Russians might use a nuclear weapon. I think that's putting it very, very high. And you have to say, what kind of nuclear weapon? The discussion has mainly been about things that are sometimes called tactical nuclear weapons. There's no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon, because if you use any kind of nuclear weapon, you're crossing a threshold that has not been crossed since 1945. That is a strategic decision, even if it's an artillery shell, a battlefield nuclear weapon. Small nuclear weapons, would not necessarily do a lot more damage than the damage already being done. In the smallest nuclear weapons would cover the equivalent of a few football fields without a very big radiation cloud. That doesn't mean that we're instantly into World War III. Putin's trying to scare us with this stuff. He's trying particularly to scare the Germans, especially before the German elections, because candidate Friedrich Merz is in favor of Germans sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine, which the SPD leadership have so far refused to do. I can conceive, and Putin has used blackmail, nuclear blackmail, pretty effectively. It has definitely constrained what the Americans and NATO and we ourselves have done, and why we've tiptoed up rather slowly in the kit we provide to Ukraine. What are the circumstances in which he might use a nuclear weapon? I mean, the problem is you can't say they're zero. I think that the only circumstance in which Putin would be likely to do this would be if he actually felt that he personally, his rule in Russia, or Russian territory, serious Russian territory, I don't mean a few kilometers of Kursk Oblast, was in threat of being lost, in particular Crimea. Because the annexation of Crimea was the most popular single thing that Putin has done in all his years in power. And people of all points of view in Russia basically rejoiced, and they said, it's ours and we've got it back again. And losing Crimea would be a massive blow to Putin, and indeed it might be something that toppled him from power. Had the Ukrainians, when they were doing quite well on the battlefield in 2023, seriously pushed towards Crimea, and if the only way of stopping them, and that's two ifs, had been to explode a small, low-yield, so-called battlefield nuclear weapon, maybe on a formation crossing the isthmus, some such situation like that, then Putin would certainly have considered doing so. And he wants, of course, to keep us in doubt, which is why we're getting a lot of this rhetoric. The Chinese would be very, very strongly against Putin using a nuclear weapon, and I'm sure they've told him that loud and clear. And Putin has certainly been told through channels by the Americans that were he to do this, that there would be a massive conventional response, not nuclear, but conventional response against Russian military targets by NATO, essentially by American weapons. And the Americans would wipe out quite a lot of Russian military and kit in that conventional response. So I won't say we can all sleep easily in our beds, because this is a very dangerous, fraught situation. It's a very nasty war. But I think that the probability of this going even small nuclear is very, very low. But it's not zero.
Putin has been a thread throughout our discussion this evening. We'll finish there. Adrian Cartwright wonders whether an assassination attempt on him by internal or external forces might be a possibility. But Julie really has the last word. She asks, how will Putin be remembered by the Russian people and as a figure in the history of Russia?
Well, of course, we have seen leaders assassinated in different countries, including Russia, back in the days of the Tsars. It could only be done by somebody very close to Putin. Putin is surrounded. He's a coward. He's terrified. He was terrified long before all this happened. He has massively over-engineered his own security. I don't think any leader in history has had so many layers of security around him. And the people he has put in charge of his security at all levels are people who not only, he thinks, super loyal to him, but above all, they are his accomplices. They are actually accomplices in his criminality and his corruption. So if he were to go, they too would be vulnerable. So there's quite powerful disincentives to do it. If one of his bodyguards put a bullet in his head, that person would be dead within seconds. So it's a pretty improbable scenario. I also think it would be very dangerous, because if Putin was assassinated, within about 2.5 nanoseconds, the people around him would be blaming the West for doing that. And they'd be saying, this is the CIA. and we would be in a very, very dangerous situation. So much as I wish to see the back of Mr. Putin, not that way. How will he be remembered? I think he will be remembered in 30 years' time, 40 years' time in Russian history books as the man who lost Ukraine, the man who destroyed the Russian economy. He'll be remembered worse than Brezhnev, who is remembered as for the period of stagnation and the economy running down. They have mixed views about Stalin right now, in that they agree that some of the Gulag was a bit excessive and assassinating people to that level, but on the other hand, Stalin's great achievement, which they still worship, was that, as the greatest achievement of the Soviet Union, was to defeat the Nazis, which, in Russian telling, was done almost entirely by the Soviet Union without much assistance from anybody else, and doesn't mention the fact that the largest number of casualties, Russian casualties, they say, we lost 20 million people defeating the Nazis. The largest pro rata percentages of those 20 million people were, wait for it, Ukrainians and Belarusians, rather than Russians. But Putin will not have that to his name. He will have taken Russia from a rather good position, the one I described at the beginning, to a pretty awful situation by the time he ends, and he may be remembered as the person who put Russia, I think he will be remembered in a negative way, as the person who put Russia in the hands of China, which was the thing that Russians never wanted to do. And just to finish with one tiny anecdote, when I was living in Moscow, I was constantly being told by ordinary Russians that out in the far east of Russia, where of course they never went, but I did, they said there are 2 million illegal Chinese immigrants. They're infiltrating our cities. You go to places like Vladivostok, and there are these Chinatowns and Irkutsk and so on. Well, I did go to Irkutsk and Vladivostok and Blagoveshchensk and these other places, and there are no Chinese there. And last time I was in Vladivostok, as the taxi driver was taking me to the airport, I said, I haven't seen any Chinese here. I've seen a lot of Koreans, I've seen a lot of Japanese cars, a lot of foreign investment. I've seen no Chinese at all. He said, no, we don't allow them in Vladivostok, he said, but you should go to Moscow. There are 2 million illegal Chinese immigrants in Moscow.
We have run over time tonight on a very important subject. I think we've had a wonderful, enriching talk from Sir Roderic, which has therefore promoted this terrific discussion with him. It's been informative, thoughtful, provocative, and I hope you agree with me. It's been a great evening. Thank you, Sir Roderic Lyne. Take a bow.